Hi, I'm Noel McCarthy, Professor of Epidemiology at the University of Warwick and Knowledge Mobilisation Lead for the Health Protection Research Unit in Genomics and Enabling Data. This short video is to describe the idea of knowledge and mobilisation in general and specifically as applied to the Health Protection Research Unit in Genomics and Enabling Data. So before thinking of research, let's consider a planning cycle in some other area of society. Perhaps we're running a school or running a factory or any other area where we've got a certain current practice and policy for how we do things. But we want to consider, might we do it better? So we might review that and find some problems or find questions that we need to answer to guide how we run it. Or we might have a plan for a particular intervention we want to try out or a tool we need to develop. So having got that, we will then proceed with some work, perhaps some research work, perhaps implementing our plan or developing a tool. We go on, we have the findings of our research or the tools that we've generated, and then we try these out and see, can the findings help us to change our practice or keep it as it is if it seems to be best, or will the new tools we've developed help us to practice better? And through that continuous cycle, on we go and we get an ever-improving quality of how we do things in our institution. So that's this idea of very much directly commissioned research or tool development or innovation to guide practice. So let's now consider research from a different angle, often called pure research, where we've got this happy band of researchers around the world who, in a particular discipline, they're here together at the party after their conference. And their goal is to have a deep and full understanding of their discipline. So there'll be problems that are acknowledged as important within the discipline and questions. People do the research on that, get findings or develop tools to help them doing the research. And then reviewing those will have further deeper questions. And through this cycle, we get a deep and full understanding of some particular subject area. And that's really valuable. It's natural and human, whether that be deepest cosmology or anything else. There are some of these areas where there is no practical application, but there's a really worthwhile research activity to actually deepen human understanding. So now let's consider a situation between the two. So here again, in the bottom right hand corner, we've got our group of happy researchers, and I'll pop myself in amongst them. And their focus is on identifying questions and problems in their discipline, conducting research to address those, having findings that give a deeper understanding, and therefore going through this cycle that is an ever deeper understanding of their subject area of interest, or ever improved methods to address it if they're methodologists. But let's now think that these researchers are actually working in an area where there's also a practical applied activity in the same area, such as infectious disease control or health protection. So alongside these researchers, there's another whole pile of people who are practitioners and policymakers who work in that same broad subject area. So if the research that's happening here is that sort of more investigator-led research without much direct engagement with the community of policymakers and practitioners who are going to use it, we may then have the investigators doing research that produces new and interesting knowledge in the domain where those people are practicing. So then we'll get this thought of they've got new knowledge, they want to disseminate it and send it across to the users and write them policy papers or just write their academic papers, but write them in a way that can be used by practitioners and policymakers. And that sense of knowledge dissemination, and if we're writing grants for research, we'll often have to argue how, as well as of interest to researchers, there will be these wider impacts and how we're planning to disseminate that. So if we then consider the specific case of a health protection research unit, where we have this idea that we are doing quite involved technical high-level research that can indeed get a deep knowledge worthy of publication in good scientific journals, but is also very much for direct application in an area of current practice and policy to ultimately improve public health. Well, then that dissemination model is just not good enough. We need to find something that brings in some aspects of the idea of an institution that's directly commissioning research or innovation or tools for its day-to-day practice. And how we're going to do that then will surely not be by having the group of practitioners quite distant from the group of researchers, but rather in some way saying that we have to form a single community that includes both the practitioners / policymakers and the researchers, who will each have their own roles now, but will be working closely and intimately together. So when we're thinking of the research questions that are going to be addressed, or the tools that are going to be specified for development, that will bring the understanding of the practitioners and the researchers to frame the issues in current practice into research questions that can be addressed or tool specifications that can be followed. Then the technical work of the research or methods development will happen and is coming back, but there won't be a paper sending the findings back now, because we're part of one community. So there will be an iterative process of trying out, are these findings relevant, are they working, are these tools optimal, or do they need refining? And indeed, if you are to use them, how do we need to present them to you? That idea of actually a discussion rather than a message being sent in terms of the communication. So we're then getting a much more efficient engagement where the research will more directly address the real and priority problems, and also it will be doing it and forming products in a way that are much more likely to get implemented into practice, and the practitioners will be developing their sophistication as users of research so that they will be better able to work with researchers in defining and setting up projects, and also better at taking those findings and integrating them into their usual practice. So as this community forms, that includes researchers but also practitioners, and indeed perhaps others like policymakers or members of the public who are involved in research through public involvement in research, well then we'll get this group jointly defining the problems and the questions, but also perhaps participating in the process of research, refining the tools being developed and so forth. And then the opposite side of this is when the decisions are being made by practitioners and policymakers, the researchers have a more direct capacity to be involved in input to that through ongoing relationships and communication. So this changing to an idea of community is really central to the idea of knowledge mobilisation, and for the Genomics and Enabling Data Health Protection Research Unit, that community might include the wider parts of Public Health England who may be users of the tools being developed, other health protection research units, whether they be subject area ones like gastrointestinal infections, or other cross-cutting areas like modelling, where we might do some joint work and apply our tools and methods alongside their models. But clearly it may include people outside the narrow Public Health England Health Protection Research Unit community, other researchers in the wider community, be that international public health researchers and public health bodies, etc. So we've got this idea of community as really central to knowledge mobilisation, relationships, engagement, a culture of joint work, the development of skills that arise out of that amongst researchers, policymakers, practitioners and others, to allow us to best jointly frame research questions, undertake research and ensure that the findings are implemented. But within that community framework, there is a role for a lot of other specific activities where we bring our awareness of knowledge mobilisation as a priority to bear on how we do our work. So let's think about data sets that we create or collate and that we think might be useful, not just to researchers, but also to policymakers and practitioners. Well, how accessible are those in terms of barriers we put to gain access? Or can we actually actively make them accessible by really good data visualization interfaces to allow a wide user base? And similarly, if we have a new method or tool and we frame that in a good software implementation that makes it easily usable, intuitively usable, well, that's likely to be taken up by a much larger range of researchers, practitioners, or other possible members of the target audience. And indeed, writing has a role, whether that be a research paper, policy paper, guidelines. When we're working with this in this community, the hope is that we will also then, when we're writing these items, do it in a way that includes input that will help us to target them better so our messages get across. So here's some examples within the Genomics and Enabling Data Health Protection Research Unit of those additional technologies we can deploy for knowledge mobilisation. So the four themes of the research unit are written up here, and I'm going to pick out in relation to two. First, interface and implementation, led by David Annanson. And here we see a picture of the Prime Minister in New Zealand who's looking at data for COVID in New Zealand displayed on a screen using MicroReact, a visualization interface developed by David Annансon's group that brings together epidemiological and genomic data as an example of reaching out into wider user groups by having good interfaces. And down at the bottom from the outbreak analysis theme of the Health Protection Research Unit, I'm picking out this Transphilo software that has been developed in the past by Xavier Didelot and colleagues who leads this theme as well as the overall HPRU. And in this case, the current work within the HPRU is a publication for this journal, Current Protocols in Bioinformatics. But that's the journal that puts out papers that describe better how to use software, and not just a user's guide, but also how to simulate data and try it out on that simulated data so people can learn to use it easily and make sure they're using it properly. So sticking with the Health Protection Research Unit in Genomics, specific plans for knowledge mobilisation include active links with other health protection research units and public health England departments. This idea is, per the last slide, of integrating knowledge mobilisation within each of the themes, training junior researchers who come through so that they frame their questions with an idea of knowledge mobilisation as part of a community that includes practitioners and policymakers as appropriate, and indeed the public. That we also engage in training such as workshops with the broader community, other health protection research units and other parts of Public Health England, so that they can come and gain skills to use our tools, but also guide us in how to communicate and frame our tools to best serve their needs. And alongside these quite strategic planned activities, the idea that our knowledge mobilisation will be opportunistic, where we see opportunities arising and to take them, and also evaluative, that we're continuously monitoring how well are we getting our tools out into the public, whether that be monitoring downloads or other methods to see our impact. So if you're a researcher in the Health Protection Research Unit in Genomics and Enabling Data interested in some knowledge mobilisation, please feel free to catch me. My email's there, dean.mccarthy@warwick.ac.uk. And indeed equally people outside the Health Protection Research Unit who are keen to work with us on using our approaches, do please feel to contact me and we'll see what we can do. Thank you.